Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so I really hope that everybody is okay. So welcome to the fourth series of the online short course series. Now for these sessions, we have Dr. Udi Samanhudi, PhD, and the moderator with Bapak Ilvia. I'm sorry, I don't know your complete name. I forgot to prepare that. Sorry, yeah. So everybody is here today. So it's 1:30 already. So Pak Ilvi, yeah, please.
Okay, thank you, Bunina. Yeah, that's my complete name, but it's okay. Just call my last name because it's simpler. Okay, first of all, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi
Hmm.
wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Yeah, it's so great to see you back again in online short course series. And as for today, this is online short course series 4, right? So before we continue to the topic, I would like to review a little bit what we have had on online short course series 1 until 3. So in online short course series 1, we had Dr. Erlin Early from Queen's University Belfast revealing an interesting topic on systematic review research. And then on online short course series 2nd, we have Dr. Aisling O'Boyle, okay, speaking also an interesting topic on corpus-based research. And then the latest one with Dr. Ibrar Bat, discovering, maybe a hype topic today, speaking about digital literacy in social sciences. And as for today, in online short course series 4, we also have a very intriguing topic. Okay, maybe you have heard from the title. It is about narrative inquiry in social research. Perhaps maybe it comes to your mind when you heard the word narrative, right? Maybe it deals with story, like storytelling. And then there are so many questions to me personally about narrative inquiry. Is it really possible to have research in narrative? I mean, like, can we just tell stories and then it can be a research and it can be a journal or something? Right? And fortunately, today, we have somebody to answer all those questions, all our curiosity, right? We have a prominent scholar from Universitas Sultan Ageng Tirtayasa. We have Dr. Udi Samanhudi. So, Pak Udi, good afternoon.
Hi, Kelvin, good afternoon. Thank you very much.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's so good to see you.
Very good to meet you online on screen.
Yeah. Right.
Yes.
So before I hand it over the screen to Pak Udi, I would like to read briefly his amazing resume, right, about Dr. Udi Samanhudi. So Dr. Udi Samanhudi holds his doctorate degree in the area of teaching English to speakers of other languages, or we know as TESOL, from the School of Social Sciences, Education and Social Work from Queen's University of Belfast, UK. And now he teaches at the Department of English Education and as well as manages International Office of Sultan Ageng Tirtayasa University. And his current responsibilities as the head of International Office of Untirta are something like initiating collaboration with partner campus overseas and would include facilitating research collaborations projects, student mobility, and international scholarship programs, and also facilitating online courses just like what we have today, right? Talking about Dr. Udi, his research interests in the areas such as genre analysis, corpus linguistics, English for academic purposes, classroom action research, narrative inquiry, of course, language teacher educations, and academic literacy. Right. And Dr. Udi also very active as a facilitator in series of national training for school teachers and university lecturers in Indonesia, focused on especially classroom action research and active learning conducted by the Indonesian Ministry of Education and Culture. Right. And then he has also published several journals, international journals, national journals, and so on. So, ladies and gentlemen, right, without speaking anymore, but before that, right, before I hand it over to Dr. Udi, so Dr. Udi, are you ready? By the way?
I'm ready for coffee.
Yeah, okay, right. Snip the coffee first, right?
Right, I'm ready, of course, yes.
Okay, but before we begin, right, I would like to state a simple rule for the discussion. So it is like a free discussion. Am I right, Dr. Rudy?
Yes, you're right.
Yeah, so feel free if you have questions, right, during his presentations, you can post questions, right? You can simply click the icon raise and then, or you can simply open up your mic and then you can raise questions or ask the questions to Dr. Udi. Okay, and I think that would be all for me. So I would like to hand over the screen to Dr. Udi. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Udi.
Right, thank you very much, Amy. I'm very delighted to be part of this online series. And this time with me will be focused on narrative inquiry, which is actually part of the qualitative research in general. Right, let me try to share screen. Right, just to make sure and to double check, can everyone see the slide?
Sure.
Right, okay, very good. All right, Ilmi, once again, thank you very much for such a brief and concise introductions about me and a little bit about this online short course in general. We started this online short course by inviting Dr. Erin from Queen's University Belfast with systematic review. And then we had also Aisling, you are right. And then the last, we had our session with Dr. Aisling Boyle about corpus studies. And now this is my turn on qualitative approaches to research. Particularly special, we'll be speaking more and more and discuss more and more on issues related to narrative inquiry. Right, so these three are the purposes of our session 1, because we still have another session for tomorrow. So what I aim in this session is that to help you better understand, first of all, the nature of inquiry as a form of qualitative research. This is very important because we need to really know where this approach is situated in the literature of qualitative research. And then narrative data, there are a lot of types of data in narrative research. And then this session will only focus on one type of it, that is oral narrative. And then we will take a look at very closely the types of oral narratives and then how we analyze those data from oral narratives. And then ethical issues, this is something that we really need to put concerns more and more, because a lot of researchers in the area of qualitative research have been problematized, because many of us sometimes really ignore something that is really vital in research studies in qualitative area, which is ethical issues. And then we will take a look closely as well the ethical issues in the context of narrative inquiry studies. Right, so these are the three purposes of this session. And then what I really want you to think from now on is that about the qualitative research in general, and then the positionality of narrative inquiry. Where is it? Is it part of qualitative? Is it actually like an independent research approach? So we will together discuss this in this section. To answer all those three aims, to achieve all the three aims that I mentioned in the previous slide, I'm referring to these two popular and very influential books in the area of narrative inquiry. So if you go online and then check these two books, then you will find out very good insights about narrative inquiry. Ilmi is correct, saying that narrative inquiry is still in a big question whether or not it is a kind of methodology, because everyone can tell stories. Can stories be brought into research? That's actually the big question. And these two books will help you answers all that kind of queries or questions, so that you will have more and better insights of narrative inquiry in general. So I'm referring to this book, Narrative Inquiry in Language Teaching and Learning Research, by Gary Barhuizen et al. Or colleagues, and then Handbook of Narrative Inquiry, Mapping a Methodology by Jean Clendenin and colleagues. So Jean Clendenin has been very popular, particularly in the UK, for her work on the area of narrative inquiry. So I would really recommend you to take a look closely these two books and try to get to know more in details about narrative inquiry. Right. I will focus on qualitative in general because I need to think about the positionality of a narrative inquiry, and then I will need to show to you where the narrative inquiry is situated within the umbrella of qualitative research. So when we are speaking about qualitative research in general, a focus of a qualitative researcher would be on better understanding a phenomenon. So your lens as a qualitative researcher would focus on providing an in-depth results of analysis of a certain phenomenon. And this perspective, these attitudes, beliefs, and experiences of participants that join our research, for example, are coming from interaction. So people-to-people interaction will produce experiences. So I'm experiencing an interaction with you right now. I will bring with me a sense of experience that I can tell to other people. So if we are speaking about the key focus of qualitative research in general, that would be on providing a better understanding of a phenomenon. And this phenomenon could be students' belief about teaching and learning English, teachers' belief about, like a good method of teaching English as a foreign language, or teacher attitudes toward teaching us, using a certain method, for example, communicative language teaching method. So all these kind of things is actually the focus of qualitative research in general. So if somebody asks, hey, what is the key focus of qualitative research? Very simple, to better understand a phenomenon. And goals of qualitative research in the literature have been very clear. There are some other goals that I couldn't mention here, but most of the goals of qualitative research in general will be to explore a phenomenon. Why are you doing a qualitative research? Because you want to explore a phenomenon. You want to find out details, information about why something happens. If you, for example, observe a classroom, and then you see, for example, from 40 students, there are more than 50% look very lazy in studying English, then you can ask yourself, what happens? Then as a qualitative researcher, you will always ask that kind of question in order to better understand that kind of situation. So you explore, you inquire into or discuss this kind of problem in order to tell and report in your qualitative research. Or sometimes you just simply want to describe something happening. For example, while those students are really lacking of motivation in studying English, you describe the characteristic of those students who are not well motivated in learning English. Better than those two is the interpretation. So when your aim is to provide an interpretation of a phenomenon, you are at a much higher level of qualitative research goal. You are trying to explain the meaning. By trying to explain why something happens, you are contributing to the development of knowledge in the field. Okay, but in general, in practice, to our observation, it is clear that a qualitative researcher would not only sometimes focus on the exploration, but sometimes combine these three all together. And these three practices of exploring, describing, and interpreting a phenomenon would be vital part in the process of narrative research itself that I will describe more and more in the following stage of my presentation. So qualitative research study, again, for you who are really interested in doing qualitative research, always and always remember that when you are doing a qualitative research, you will try to find out what people think. You are trying to, invite people to share their experiences, what they understand about something. You want to know more about what they think about the phenomenon, how they feel about that kind of phenomenon. Okay, if you come to a classroom and then interviewing a teacher, and then you can ask what he or she thinks about students in learning English, for example. Are they motivated? If they are motivated, what are the indicators that they are motivated? So you can always ask more and more deeply to the teacher, because he is somebody who knows a lot about the students and the teaching and learning practice in the classroom in general, and how she or he feels about the teaching and learning practice itself. So that's the focus of we as a qualitative researcher. So always bear in the mind that as a qualitative researcher, you really want, again, to better understand a phenomenon. And take a look at these characteristics of qualitative research that is also applicable to narrative inquiry in general, that I will elaborate further in my presentation later. So a qualitative researcher would always think about the authenticity of the setting. You are not trying to make up a situation. You are not trying to do an experiment. You are dealing with human participants in natural setting. Okay, so if you want to know how the teaching and learning practice in school X, you cannot just send questionnaire to them. You will need to come and see what happens there in school X, because you have to really immerse yourself in the setting. That's the very first characteristic of qualitative research. It's so participant oriented. It is, yes, very subjective, you are right, but then you are really participant oriented because you really want to know the ideas coming from your participants, not from you. That's why a qualitative researcher would always be warned about the theories. Sometimes it's important to have theories when you want to know about motivation issue in school X. Then you have some theories about motivation, that's very important. But sometimes it's very helpful when you try to put it aside first before then you come to the school, because you will really need to find out what is really happening in the school, not what the theory says about motivation, but what you see, what you observe from the school about the students' motivation. It's holistic, of course, because one thing would be related to something else. If you are focusing on student motivation, for example, you just cannot ignore an important element that is related to it. For example, the teacher's teaching method, the neighborhood around the schools, the parents, the community in general. A lot of things are really interrelated with the practice of teaching and learning in the classroom. So that as a qualitative researcher, we would always need to think about something else beyond the classroom whereby we are conducting the research. And it is inductive. The process of data analysis in qualitative research is very inductive. You cannot start with the theory, but you really have to start from data, and then you can see what are in the data. All right, so all these characteristics are also found in narrative inquiry that I will again present in my next page of this presentation. Now, it's getting much clearer, the positionality of narrative inquiry within the theory of qualitative research approaches. So when we are speaking about qualitative research paradigm or qualitative research approaches, there are a lot of approaches in qualitative research, and these 5 are the common approaches that we see in the literature. If you see, we have grounded theory. I will not explore more because this is not the right time to do that, but I believe you can read in this column. What I will focus on is narrative research, because this is what I really need to explore today in section 1, where narrative research is positioned under the literature of qualitative research in general. So if you ask me, is narrative inquiry a qualitative research? It is, yes. It is an approach in qualitative research. It is a form of qualitative research that is different from other approaches. What makes it different? The difference is on its focus. Any research that use stories as data will be part of narrative research or narrative inquiry in a general term. Okay, then if you see all these book covers that you, of course, can search online and you can download for free. Some of them are free already, but some you need to pay. You see, for example, forms or types of qualitative research here. Qualitative research, it is clear from the title, it is just qualitative research. But sometimes people ask, doing narrative research, well, is narrative research qualitative? Then the answer would be yes, it is another type of qualitative research. Then you see, for example, another book with the title Autobiography or Autoethnography. And then you ask again, is it quantitative or qualitative? I would say that part of qualitative research. Case study, phenomenological research, grounded theory, these are all examples of types of qualitative research. So I hope you start like getting insights about the the width of a qualitative research itself. When you get confused, when you are doing qualitative research, for example, and then you want to know which type, then you can start take a look at this. Maybe your research could be on case study because it's only focused on small scale of participants. For example, you only involve 3 to 5 people, or a single classroom or a single school, then you can do case study. If you focus on stories as your data, then you can do another qualitative type, which is called narrative research. Take a deep breath. I know it's sometimes very very challenging to study something new, but I believe that for many of you this is not even new. But if you find that kind of situation, it's time for us to refresh our knowledge about qualitative research in general, and in particular about narrative inquiry. I'll pause and I will ask Ilmi to ask you to do something in order to tie the knowledge and information about qualitative research and the positionality of narrative inquiry in 5 to 7 minutes. Ilmi.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Udi. So, ladies and gentlemen, please type in the chat box, okay, what you have had in your mind about qualitative research. It could be in a string of sentences or in just 2 or 3 words about qualitative research. For example, you have 2 words about qualitative research: study of perspective, for example.
Right, Ilmi.
Human perspective, for example, right?
Okay. So feel free to write down
Feel
whatever
free
you
to
have
write whatever you have in your mind.
in
Yep.
your mind about
That's right.
qualitative in general,
Mhm.
and then the positionality of narrative inquiry that I have just explained. And after this, we'll move on to the next stage, which is about narrative inquiry itself.
Okay. Yep. We invite all the participants to write in the chat box anything you want to share about qualitative research. Mhm. Okay. Others, right? Wow, cool. Right.
Yeah, LB, as you can see, many of them
Yep.
write to better
Yeah.
understand a phenomenon, which is exactly right. That's what qualitative research in general is. I mean, the main aim of it.
Okay. Most.
Exploration,
Yep.
description, and interpretation.
Interpretations, right? Phenomena, right?
Right. Cool.
No, we still have 3 minutes, 3 more minutes.
Qualitative research is a research about phenomenon, case study, grounded theory. Correct. Great. So
Exploration, description, and interpretation. Yep, that's it.
this is another interesting idea. Qualitative is understanding a concept or experience. That's right, Ilya.
Concept of
Yeah.
experience.
Okay, that's cool. Right. So this is what we mean by building a meaning of something that we learn. So if you can understand something and then you put it in print, you write it, and then you are actually trying to strengthen your understanding about the concept. This is very good, I think, to to strengthen your understanding about the concept of qualitative research that we discussed today. Combination between narrative inquiry and research possible?
Possible, right?
I would say very possible. Very possible, but we need another session to explore this too. But if the question is possible, it's very possible because we can embed one type of qualitative research in another type of qualitative research. That's very possible.
Yeah. Involves collecting and analyzing non-numerical data to understand concepts, phenomenon. Yeah.
Right. So
That's right.
this participant, Lucy Suraya, is trying to show us like the differences between quantitative and qualitative by bringing the issue of non-numerical data. Because like numerical data and non-numerical is what like quantitative and qualitative. That's great.
We're not dealing with numbers.
We're not dealing with numbers. Though sometimes we work with the frequency or percentages, but that's not like quantitative research. That's part of qualitative, but that's not about quantitative, right? Okay. So,
anything else? Anything else? Right? Yep. Okay. Right. Thank you so much for participating and makes the chat box more lively. Yeah.
Great. So now I continue the journey.
Be my guest.
All right. Okay. Oh, why cannot I move the slide? Right. Now we'll focus on the narrative inquiry, which is actually the main of the discussion in this session. If Ilmi asks a question on whether or not narrative inquiry is possible or whether or not narrative inquiry is really a research study, I would say it's definitely yes. All right, so it's now my responsibility to really give you or provide you some insights about the narrative inquiry and show to you that narrative inquiry has a specific method and methodology which shows that it is, yes, a research approach, which is again under the umbrella of research, qualitative research paradigm. So getting back a little bit to the concept of the narrative turn, if you see several decades ago, narrative was not really popular. Narrative research was not as popular as other types of qualitative research. But then people are getting more and more aware that stories provide meaning. So if we listen to stories or if we read stories, then we will get something meaningful from them sometimes. And if we really try to in-depth or to do an in-depth analysis of stories, we will always and always find out meanings from those stories. Then people are getting more attracted to the issue of narrative as research because they are aware that narrative provide us something that we can learn from them. So this narrative turn finally happens. And now if you see journals in the area of English or in the area of ELT or English language teaching, a lot of narrative inquiries have been accepted by the editors and published as part of the qualitative type that is promising. Okay, so that any researcher, qualitative researchers who really want to try to explore the qualitative research, particularly narrative inquiry, you are welcome to do this research and please send to the publisher. I believe that they will be very interested in publishing as long as the research or the narrative study that you offer to them is authentic and provide meanings to your readers. Now, these are the four main reasons why narrative turn happens or occurred, especially in social sciences. Those experts in the social sciences are getting quote unquote bored with the word variables. They are trying to see more and more meaning, which sometimes cannot be represented by simply measuring variables. They want to go deeper into something called stories or data in order to get values from it. So this kind of hesitance to numbers and variables, something called variables, then like encourage more and more social scientists to work with stories. So they then label this research into narrative inquiry. So it's very simple actually why there is something called the narrative turn. That's simply because people in social sciences or a group of people, a group of scientists in social science field is trying to vary or trying to question the issue of variable which somehow cannot fully represent the meaning within the data. So people then turn into more qualitative research approach with narrative inquiry as part of it. Two basic modes of thoughts, way of ordering experience, or two approaches of telling your experience. We have paradigmatic, which is very common, which is something that we mostly do. We write a research paper and then we argue for the finding that we found in our investigation. So we write it quote unquote scientifically. We provide it in a very good academic writing that we so-called practice. So when we are within that kind of domain of practice, we are actually applying what we call as paradigmatic approach. Okay. The other way is to provide or to put our data or whatever it is called in the form of narrative. So narrative is like you are telling something narratively, of course. You are telling the experience of others narratively. So if you are familiar with narrative text, that's the way how we narrate our data. Okay, so of course then the choice of words would be a little bit different from the other way of presentations of data that we that uses paradigmatic approach. So in the literature, just to again make you aware that we've been exposed to this kind of approaches in presenting our data paradigmatically and narratively. Can we combine these two? That may be your question. Yes, I will show you some example of narrative research that combine these two approaches when they are writing a paper of narrative inquiry. Right. Then the following question will be, what is actually narrative inquiry? All right. A lot of definitions. If you Google, you write down narrative inquiry, you actually get the answer. But I come with a conclusion that the narrative inquiry definition by Jean Clendenin and Michael Connolly is very concise and very easy to understand and has been referred by current researchers in the field. So if your question is what narrative inquiry, it is the study of experience. And experience, as John Dewey taught, is a matter of people in relation contextually and temporally, right? So if you see here, the very first keyword is that the experience. It's just like qualitative research in general. The focus of narrative inquirer or the focus of narrative researcher would be on providing an in-depth results of analysis of participants' experience. So we try to better understand somebody's experience through the lens of narrative inquirer. So it's about the experience of others and the experience of us as researchers sometimes when we do, for example, autoethnography research that I will explain to you later on. So if we get back to the characteristic of qualitative research in general, there is always context, there is always setting. So the authentic setting, the original setting is very important in the context of narrative inquiry that again resembles the main characteristic of qualitative research in general. And time is always important in narrative inquiry because that shows when an event happens. When an event happens, like one event before another one and or after another one. So the issue of tempo or time is really matters in narrative inquiry. It is an established umbrella term for research involving stories. If you see what Clandinin again said about narrative inquiry, any research that use stories as data would be called as narrative inquiry. Okay? It is a way of understanding experience. It is a collaboration between researcher and participants over time in a place or series of places and in social interaction with medias. Okay, so if you read this, you will see a very active relation and interaction between the researcher and the participant or the subject, because you are trying to make meaning of the experience. So imagine when you are interviewing a participant, for example, when you are asking question, you will not just like referring to your question you prepare, you would always try to clarify, to confirm, to double check, because you really want to understand fully the meaning brought through your participant experiences. All right, so that's what narrative inquiry, the big and the basic concept of narrative of inquiry would be about stories as data, and you as the narrative researcher would focus on understanding these stories and bring this into your papers. In its fullest sense, narrative inquiry requires going beyond the use of narrative as rhetorical structure that is simply telling stories to an analytic examinations of the underlying insight and assumption that the story illustrates. So when you are dealing with narrative research, when you've got like the stories or the narratives, then you will not only focus on the structure, which many linguists did and have been doing so far. Okay, an applied linguist would focus on the use of certain words, the repeated pattern of certain phrases. A narrative inquirer do more than that. You are trying to go deeper, trying to bring, from the data, from the stories, the values, the lessons. Okay, so that's in its fullest sense when we are speaking about narrative inquiry. When you place yourself as a narrative inquirer, then you will ask, what should I do as a narrative inquirer? What to do when I decide to, focus on being a narrative researcher? Take a look at this. Narrative inquirers study the individual's experience in the world. Again, the key word is experience. An experience that was stored both in the living and telling, and that could be studied by listening, observing, living alongside another, writing and interpreting text. In my following stage of this presentation, I will show to you two different approaches in data analysis called analysis of narrative and narrative analysis. So this issue of what to do as a narrative inquirer then would require kind of understanding of narrative as a text and narrative as an action. I'll show it to you. But before then, you have to really be, happy when you say, oh, okay, I'm a narrative inquirer. What is actually the strength of being a narrative researcher, or what is actually the strength of doing something called narrative research? You really have to know. So the main strength of narrative inquiry lies in its focus on how people use stories to make sense of their experiences. So again, it's about experiences and then your attempt to understand and provide a better understanding to people about the experience of others and experience of yourself and the value that you can offer to people. So that's the power of qualitative research in general, which is also reflected in the research that is focused on narratives. And the central concern, again, to remind you, it's the stories that the narrators tell about their life experiences. Okay, so when we are speaking about life experiences, this could be like in a smaller person, this could be in a long and big person. When I, for example, interview one of my colleagues here, for example, because Ilmi is a teacher, for example, so I want to know the thinking and the feeling of him being a teacher. So I can focus on a small narrative, for example, something small about his experience in the classroom. Then I can, focus on something bigger. I can focus on his life as a teacher. So it depends on what I want to focus on. But again, the thing is that when we are speaking about narrative inquiry or narrative research, we are focusing ourselves on the stories our participants tell us. Why stories? You can read. There are a lot of things that we can learn from stories. Again, the basic idea why people listen to stories or read stories, because we want to get lessons, because there are values that we can learn from the stories that we listen or we read. And we here, as a narrative researcher, let's put our lens now as a narrative researcher, then really have to know that when we are practicing ourselves as a narrative researcher, we will try to do this. We put storytelling activities and research together. Because if you only do storytelling, it's not research yet. But when you are combining storytelling and certain methodology that fits in narrative inquiry, then you are doing narrative research. Okay? Because narrative inquiry is much more than the telling stories. It's not only about telling stories. It is also about making meaning of life experiences in the process of telling stories, which means that there is a kind of method in order to gain the values or the lessons from the stories that we get from the participants. And stories in the inquiry process, researchers collect stories. Sometimes the data are in the form of stories already. For example, memoirs or biographies. They are in the form of stories, and then they are data that we can analyze. But sometimes researchers try to put together from an interview, for example, stories that can we configure from the stories, from the interview transcripts that we have from the participants. So we can get back to real narratives or the stories that already exist in the form of memoirs, biography, and so on. Sometimes we have to do interviewing people asking them about their experience, life stories, and so on. And then within the transcript, then we see the stories. We try to configure to find out between one story with another, and then we build themes and then we report, depending or based on the focus or the purpose of the study. So for any questions about narrative inquiry, because before I move on to another slides.
Yep, feel free, all participants, if you have any questions so far about narrative inquiry. This one, there is one in the chat box. Is it always in a form of long-term research?
Well, not always.
Not always.
Yes, because we can focus on small event and big event. When it is big events means that we will take a longer time. But when we focus on small stories, for example, a small event in somebody's life, then we can do it very shortly and in a very short period of time. So it's not always. Yes.
Okay, thank you for the questions, Rindu. Others?
Okay, no?
Okay, no?
Right. I will continue
Continue.
with the next slide. Well, Rindu asked me about whether or not we have to do in such a long period of time when we are, conducting a narrative inquiry. My answer is no, not always, because we can focus on something small from somebody's life experience or somebody's life events. Okay, and then I will tell you more in the following stages of this presentation. But working with stories are relevant to researchers' work in different ways. So to get the stories, sometimes it's very complicated. What actually stories and how to get them? Well, you can get the stories as data as a process during data collection, the telling. So when somebody is telling you about his or her life experience as a teacher, for example, or as a student, then this telling will allow you to get stories. So please be very sensitive with issue of stories when you are doing an interview with a focus on gaining experiences or getting experiences from your participants. Or as an outcome of data collection, the told, when you already finish collecting all the data, then you can see a series of stories in your data. Or sometimes the story the researchers tell about the data collected or the retold. So this data in the form of stories sometimes can be retold. When you're listening to somebody telling his or her experience, then you record it in your mind. And after that, you try to write down all those stories. You create a narrative from the interview with your participants. So this retold activity can create stories or narratives.
So, Dr. Rudi,
Yes.
this is the continuation of questions from Rindu. So, in general, we can decide in any length of time to do narrative inquiry research.
Yes, sure. Again, we as a researcher, the narrative researcher would always think about the time issue, because sometimes we have very limited period of time, and then we have to really think what to focus on. Okay. Never thinks that doing narrative study would, take a long time. If you focus on somebody's life history, probably yes. But if you focus on the small part of somebody's life, for example, when you teach in school X and now you're already not there, you are moved already to a university level, so you can tell what you experienced during your, your teaching practice and experience in school X. That's all. You will not bring this into your life today. What you focus on is that what happens here when you were a teacher at school. Okay, so again, we can set the time. This narrative inquiry is very researcher friendly, quote unquote, in terms of timeline. So really think about what you are going to focus on and what kind of value I'm trying to investigate and to deeply understand from your stories or from your data. Yeah, hear me. So,
Okay, thank you.
yeah.
I think that's answered.
Norris, thank you very much. So what is story to researchers? Now, again, I want you to situate yourself as a narrative researcher because you will get the feeling of being a narrative researcher when your lens now is as a narrative researcher, not as a corpus studies researcher or systematic review researcher. You are now is brought into the fields of narrative inquiry. So your lens should be as a narrative researcher. So what is story to you as narrative researchers? Story could mean different things to different researchers, okay? Some of you might only think about long autobiographical accounts. This is something we call big theories or big stories, sorry. So your lens as a narrative researcher could be focused on somebody's life experience. You always want to know and to tell people about the values of a figure. For example, ex-president in country Y, ex-president in country X. Okay, a very famous teacher in your region, a very popular student in your school. So you want to really understand how he lives his life, how he runs his life as a good student. Then you focus on the autobiographical accounts. You ask him to write down about his life as a student, as a person, and everything. So your concentration now is with big stories. Okay? And sometimes you need to really shift into a smaller one because the time issue, like what Rindo asked me, can we make it shorter? Yes, you can focus on small stories, the snippet of conversation. So when you are making a conversation with your participants, there are stories there that you can create. You understand something, you understand the perspective of the participants about COVID-19. And then based on what you understand from the conversations, then you create short stories. Okay, these small stories then could be analyzed and presented into a research report, narrative research report in particular. You can even, find out the extracts of interview data in story form, short stories. So a lot of ways to gain data in the form of stories is not only about something you see as, for example, biography book. Stories could be made, okay? Stories could be also be found, the existing stories or the creating stories, the created one, which means that we can do small talk with our colleagues. We want to understand why he or she chooses to be an English teacher, not another profession. And then from this conversation, then we can create small stories. And then you can analyze it, which is actually part of the practice in narrative research.
Okay, so Dr. Udi, what you are trying to expound is, let's say we interview someone, right, the participant, let's say, and then we do an in-depth interview, or is it a little bit different?
Well, that's a very good question. The interview, of course, it's highly recommended to do an in-depth interview because it is through in-depth interview or conversation that you can, get meanings from that process of interviewing or conversing with other people. If it is only like for 1 minute and then finish, I'm not sure we can get stories. All right. So narrative in-depth interview is a term for narrative interview with our participants. That word in-depth is another clue in narrative inquiry. You are right.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. This one, the analytical focus. So our lens now is a narrative researcher. Okay. So we have with us a lens, an analytical lens or analytical focus. What to focus on actually when we are dealing with narrative data. Okay. You can focus on their contents. You see this one? The stories are about focus on the content. But sometimes we can also focus on, the organizations of the stories. You can understand the flow of the stories by also focusing on how the text is built, how the narratives are built, why paragraphs one say A, while paragraph B says C. It's like jumping, but there must be something there that you can further analyze and tell you something finally about what the participant actually means by jumping from one idea to another, which seems not connected to each other. So the idea of sometimes combining the content and the organization is always important when you are dealing with narrative data, because you are trying to deeply understand the narrative that you are analyzing, and then you are going to report to people that here is the value of this story. And of course then, because the qualitative researcher is always wanting other people or readers to change something in the mind or to do a certain action, then you have to show those values. You have to tell that from this experience, from the life experience of Mr. X, we learned something, this one. And by understanding this one, please do this. Implicitly, you are actually telling people to do something. It's just like a persuasive, strategy, but it's narrative way. Right. This one. Now, you maybe have like question, approaches to narrative inquiry, what to do? Now, I understand that, okay, the data in narrative inquiry are in the form of stories, but then what should I do? Okay, now I've got the data, I've got the stories, what's next? The next is that you try to understand the approaches to this narrative data, okay, or the data analysis in the context of narrative inquiry. Take a look at this. So in the fields of narrative inquiry, there are some ways to deal with narratives or stories. You can focus on doing narrative analysis, or you can think about analysis of narratives. There are options when you do narrative analysis. Okay, so what does that mean by narrative analysis? So research in which storytelling is used as a means of analyzing data and presenting findings. I'll show you the example in my following slides. So by doing narrative analysis, you will focus on stories that you gain from an in-depth narrative interview with your participants. So from the transcript, then you create the narrative, you write down in the form of narrative, okay? So you are configuring stories from the transcript and then you write in a narrative way. I'll show you in the following example. And if you could refer to the 3 papers that I have sent via book copy in the groups, you see one with narrative analysis and the other one with analysis of narrative. If you read through all these 2 examples, then you will understand how we report a narrative analysis and analysis of narrative. So get back to this narrative analysis, you are configuring stories from an interview transcript, and then you form it narrative in a narrative text. Well, analysis of narrative, your lens is a little bit different. Your focus will be on a narrative text. For example, the memoirs, the biography, or a story about people, of a figure in a magazine, okay? All those could be your narrative data. And then you analyze them and then you present it in a narrative research way of framing. So the research in which stories are used as data. So the stories are there, it already exists, and then you analyze them based on the topic of your research. I will come to these 2 with examples in my following slides. Or you can, use autobiographical and bioprefect approaches. This is what I did in my last research. I did an autobiography and combining with biographic approaches. So I combined 2 narratives, I analyzed them, and then my mission or my aim was that to tell people out there that there is sometimes similarities and differences of experience between a teacher and his student. So this is what I did. I analyze my own autobiography. So I write about me, my experience as a teacher, and then my student experience as a student of English. There are some similarities and differences, but the key thing is that I want to share with people out there that the, the, the importance of struggling as a learner and as a teacher would always be vital to survive as a professional teacher and a good student, and quote unquote. Focus on content and focus on language and discourse. This is another thing, okay? When you approach stories, you can focus simply on the content or the language. It's like doing a discourse analysis. But this one, to tell you what I observed so far, is rarely found in narrative studies because this is mostly the business of a discourse analyst. So if you do a discourse analysis, then it is there. You focus on something small within the text, like the use of repeated words to mean something, which is quite not highly recommended in narrative research, but it is part of narrative research, which means that it's fine for you to focus on the content and the language used within a narrative text, but it's probably just a complementary element because you really need to think about the big value that you can get from the text through, for example, narrative analysis or analysis of narrative. Right. So for any queries, question, feel free. I don't know if you can read this too, but I will explain, of course. I will show you that this is an example of analysis of narrative, and this is an example of narrative analysis. And these two are example of narrative research. Any questions so far?
Oh, okay. Another questions from Rindu. Okay. If previously she asked about the time limitations, now how about the participants? Is there limitations of the participants, Dr. Rudy? So
No.
is it okay to just one participants?
Yeah, you are right. Ilmi, very good question, Rindu, and thank you very much, Ilmi. If the question is there any limitation for number of students? Remember, a qualitative researcher would, would always say that even one participant is possible. So the same as narrative inquiry, even with one person is very possible. That links to this paper. It's very good. So autonomous language learning against all odds. Okay. So this text is called analysis of a narrative, which means that the data already exist as stories. This person, Go, the author, tries to analyze the life of a person, a Chinese disabled person who is really great in using English in his daily life and who is able to translate a lot of great books from English into Chinese. He was not going to school. He was not undergoing or undertaking a formal, study at schools and learn English. No. Sorry, not he, but she. She did it by herself. She was an autonomous learner of English. So how many participants? Only one participant. This very famous figure in Chinese, because she was translating a lot of official documents in the country. So what Gao analyzed here is the memoirs, and then the autobiography of the person, of the participants. And then what he focused on is on how this person, this disabled person, built his learning journey and how she finally became a master in English though in fact she was not joining a formal school for English class, for example. So if the question is there any limitation? One is very possible, okay? Which means that this is like other qualitative research in general. Focusing on one participant is very possible. More than it is also possible. How many is the limit? It depends on your research focus. If 5 is okay, why 6? If 10 is okay, why 20? If 1 is possible, why 2? All right, so again, get back to what is your purpose of the study and then decide how many participants to be involved in your narrative research. And this narrative analysis is, this is a very good example of narrative analysis. So what McCain did in this paper was simply like finding out, stories from the conversation, the discussion in the classroom that he recorded. All right, so Robert tried to capture every discussion in the classroom interaction and then build stories from that. So what he focused on is that the issue of gender and sexuality in a context of appropriate way, on whether or not queer narratives in an EFL classroom in Japan could be built. So if you get back again to this paper that I sent to you in the group, in the group of this online class, then you will find out how a narrative research is reported, or what kind of data can you, get and analyze, okay? Because the question about stories is about like, what are stories and how to collect them? Are stories only those like in novels or autobiography or biography books? It's not always those, okay? You can create the stories. And this guy, Robert McCain, helps you to understand how to build narrative from a transcript.
And Dr. Udi,
Yes,
how
please.
about the validity and reliability if we only have one participant?
It's very question that's very challenging. I will answer it later on because there will be another part, okay, in this presentation to specifically deal with the issue of validity, trustworthiness in narrative inquiry. But thanks anyway for the question.
Okay, stay tuned, Rizky Darmawan. Your concern will be answered later.
Right, okay, I'll show you in my next slides, okay? Any other question before I move on? No? Okay, I'll continue then.
Continue.
Right. So this is an example how we produce narrative from our own experience. Maggie is a popular author, and she's a researcher that concerns narrative inquiries, and then she builds data from her own experience as a teacher. And then there is a very interesting event that she experienced while she was in England, and then while she was learning English in Hungary. All right, so if you read here, she said, I'm a native speaker of Hungarian. I'm a non-native speaker of English. I use Hungarian at home and English at work. I fed up to enjoy this double life. I first encountered the English language at the age of 5 in a private kindergarten where we learned a few English nursery songs. I never learned English at school, nor was it possible in Hungary for a long time, but I always had a private English tutor. At the age of 9, I announced that I was fed up with piano lessons. My parents agreed to let me stop, but only if I promised never to give up on English. It was a deal. I studied English language and literature at the university. I had 3 outstanding professors who spoke beautiful English too. And all 3 of them had learned it in Hungary. Then I did my teaching practice. It was love at first sight and proved to be a lasting affair too. I was a school teacher for 15 years, and since then I have been a teacher trainer. So this is a kind of author, story, an author biography extract from Maggie. So she tried to gain, data from herself. So she put this as something to analyze in the, in the later stage of her research on the issue of, teaching and learning. And she was a teacher, and then she had the power to tell something and to contribute something to the world, quote unquote, from her own experience. And this is an example of data that we can create as a teacher. And take a look at this. This is another example of how she created the story that she could then later on analyze in her stage of, in the following stage of her research. It's very interesting, situation which I also experienced actually when I was undertaking my doctorate degree in the UK. She said, recently I spent some time in England. At the party, I talked to an American colleague about the linguistic and cultural deficits of non-native speaker of English. She said that despite being a native speaker, she would often feel excluded in the company of Brits, the British. As fate would have it, a few minutes later, conversation took a sudden turn around the dinner table. I was rapidly losing my bearings. Catching my eye, the American whispered to me, "This is it. I don't have the faintest idea what they are talking about either." You see, even an American who is, a native speaker of English sometimes cannot understand when a British person speaks something in English, because the vocabularies are sometimes different and the accents are very different. So this kind of experience could be something very interesting to tell to people that when you are speaking in English, think about the accents. The accent is really, with somebody's nature. So I'm, for example, from Serang. I'm Serangese. Sometimes my English sounds really like how Bantenese people speak English. And that's part of my nature as a Serangese, as a Bantenese speaking English. So when I'm speaking English in the UK, when first time coming, for example, some probably didn't understand my English, but I say, I need to survive. I will just keep talking and trying to understand other people's accents, which are totally different from mine. So this kind of, experience is something that you can tell in your narrative research. And this could be interesting, and there is value in it. That when you are studying English, for example, difficulties are always there. Even native speaker will find out difficulties in learning English. And there is always uniqueness, variation in terms of accents that everyone can bring into conversation because we are coming from different parts of the globe. So if you see, for example, from these two, the big theme is actually the experience of the non-native teacher. So as a non-native teacher, when you are meeting somebody from, America or the United Kingdom, then you will always sometimes feel excluded when you feel like, I don't understand them while I'm speaking English, all right? So you feel excluded because you cannot reach them. It's like there is kind of barrier because you cannot go into their community just because you are different. So this kind of experiences is something that you can tell in your narrative research. Feel free to ask when you have questions on this issue, okay? So we've discussed a lot of things about narrative research, narrative inquiry, but their question might be, what is actually narrative? How can I say that a story is a narrative? Because not every story is narrative, okay? You can only analyze stories which are, called narrative. What are they? Yes, they are spoken or written texts. So something spoken, something written could be called as text. So spoken or written text. Produced by people who have something to tell. So there is a character. There is somebody who tells the story. Situated in time and places, involve development over time, have structure and correspond to the development they describe, encapsulate a point that the narrator wants to get across, have purpose and meaning within the context of the telling. If you get back to these two, it's all clear that all this are in the two narratives that we've discussed just now. It is written text, produced by somebody who has something to tell. She wants to tell about her experience, being together with native speakers, that she somehow fails to adjust herself due to different accents. Situated in time and place, yes. Involved development over time, yes. When she, finally found that even a Native American couldn't understand what the Brit said. Have structures, yes. It follows the structure of storytelling, encapsulate a point that the narrator wants to get across. He has a message to tell us that, come on, variation in terms of accent is there, and difficulties to understand somebody's English is always a matter of not only you, but also me. Because we are not native speakers. Even native speakers of American couldn't understand or fail to understand, the Brits when they are speaking English. So these are called narratives, and these are data that we can analyze. So in the fields of ELT, English language teaching, I believe that many of us are from this area. Narratives could be in the form of, as I said, the narrative of personal experiences, the autobiographical narratives, or the recount of experiences of language teaching and learning. So you can focus on this when you are asking yourself, okay, if I want to do a narrative research, what to tell? What kind of data I can tell, I can write in my research report? We can go through these 3 as examples where to start your research in the fields of narrative inquiry, okay? So you can tell your personal experience, your autobiographical narrative as a teacher or as a student. You can recount of experiences of language teaching and learning as experiences that are set in the context of the teller's real or imagined everyday life or aspect of narrator identities. You build your identity as a student every time. Okay, you shift from one identity to another. Okay, so you can describe this thing. You can tell this in the narrative way, and this narrative can be analyzed through the methodology called narrative inquiry. Okay, so the forms of narrative inquiry or narrative research in language teaching so far in the literature, as you see, you can find like the language memoirs, like the journey of me as a teacher of English, the journey of my learning as a student of English when I was doing my undergraduate degree in, for example, Yogyakarta, which has different culture, and then the lecturers had different accents, I had a very surprising moment when I had such a high expectation to a lecturer who had just returned from Australia, finished or completed his study from one outstanding university in Australia. And I at the time expected that his English would be native-like or Australian English-like. They surprised me when, her accent, his accent was still really Japanese accent with the people. I said, what? So that's kind of small event you can tell, okay, is a language memoirs because you have that kinds of experience. Studies of language memoirs, you can focus it as narrative and then you focus to study it. Autobiographical case studies, biographical case studies, studies of multiple narratives. So I cannot tell you all of this during the session because I believe you can go to Google and find out. But what I think good for you is that to know the clue in narrative inquiry, and then you can do further by reading more from Google's.
Okay. So
Yes, please.
sorry, Dr. Udi.
Yes, please.
So by doing narrative inquiry research, meaning that we can do a research by let's say by not interviewing the participants directly. So meaning that we can study from his or her, memoir or
Yes.
like
You're right. You're right.
written text, isn't it? Is it possible,
so,
right?
Yeah, right. You're right. So, for example, now I'm reading a memoir of Dadang. Hazari, probably many of you do not know him, but for me, he is a great person. He is a professor in one university in Australia, and he is from a small village in Majalengka in West Java. So I'm reading his memoirs now in order to understand his journey of life from zero into a hero. So, of course, this memoir then could be, my data when I'm going to tell something about him. I can do narrative analysis on the memoir, getting the values of his life from nobody to somebody. He is now a professor, an adjunct professor in one outstanding research university in USA. And I think this is an example of printed data that we can analyze. Without interviewing him, I can tell people about him through my research studies, through my narrative inquiry lens. Okay.
Okay, noted. So let's say that we don't have any access to the persons because he is way too famous than us. So meaning that, but still we can study from his memoir, right?
It's sometimes very hard, I think, to interview Jokowi, right? So a lot of things that people write about Jokowi could be a book about Jokowi. Then we can start from that book to do a narrative research, of course. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. That was the question from Yanda.
All right. So in your Google Scholar, I'm not trying to be narcissistic, though, yeah, to some degree, I'm a narcissistic person. But if you check in Google Scholars, this is just to encourage you to do narrative research. A lot of studies that people have done, and these studies are under the umbrella of narrative inquiry. So if you take a look at this, because I'm so familiar with what I did, so this is actually a small event during my life. Okay, I'm not in my doctorate degree, or I'm already in my very real world. But then I had very interesting event that I think people can learn from me about how hard it was to write critically in university in the UK. Okay. I brought with me the concept of critical thinking and writing and reading. When I did my master's degree, I was so familiar with those. But then when I started my first module, first year, all the professors said, all your modules, essays, should reflect the doctoral degree level. I said, what is that? When you can write them critically. Okay, so then I was so confident with my skills in writing, essay critically, but I, to be honest, almost failed in one of them. A very sarcastic and strong comment on my content was from a very leading professor in qualitative research. She said, rubbish, no criticality at all in your content. I said, it's critical already. I implement all of them. We need to really be outspoken when you're meeting with the professor. We tried to better, but she said no. But then, okay, I revised, and finally she said, okay, you now pass. You met the degree of doctorate degree level for your essays. You know what? I struggle to understand the concept of critical writing that my professor think. Because in the literature, it's clear, critical writing, when you show, for example, a good result of analysis, and then you put more literature to show that you read a lot, part of the behavior, critical thinker. I did all, but she said, not yet on that level. So it is a very small event in my life that I think people can learn how to struggle, okay, in a doctorate degree program for an international student like me from Indonesia. Because when I grew up, my previous educations didn't dictate me very, very clearly about how to write critically. So this is an example of, getting back to small event in our life and then put it as a, narrative research. You frame it within the, narrative research methodology and then send it to journal. And yes, finally accepted. Though it's, through a very hard work and long journey to be published like this. Right. Okay.
Yeah. All participants must read that journal. That is very interesting one.
Yeah.
I've read it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think if you really wish to study abroad, sometimes we really need to read what your seniors have done and have experienced in order to get a picture of how it is like and what strategies you need to really do to equip yourself before you start your doctoral degree or master's degree in the future overseas. Okay, so here I just want to show you that even in Google Scholars, there are a lot of narrative studies that you can refer, which means that it's very possible for your narrative research to be published in high-ranking journals. So don't be scared, don't be skeptical, quote unquote, with narrative research, because this is, this is what many editors are looking for this time. Okay, question, please. Any question or something you can write in the chat box?
Yeah, there is one question from Erika. This one.
Yeah.
She said that I will conduct my research about learning autonomy, especially in language learning English in the university during pandemic. That means that my research must be conducted based on the narrative inquiry from the respondent. So I can collect all the information I need about learning experience, especially learning autonomy in language learning, that they are conducted during pandemic without any limitations. So my question is, what is the technique data analysis that I can use for this research?
Okay, it's very good. So in my previous slides, I think it's already clear here that there are two potential approaches that we can use. You can do narrative analysis, you can do analysis of narratives. In your case, it could be analysis of narratives because you will do an interview, you will create or you will make a transcript from the interview, and then you build stories. Okay? Sorry. Narrative analysis, not necessary. Narrative analysis. That's what I mean. So you can
the first one.
Yeah, the first one. So you can create the narrative from the results of your interview. Okay. So focus on this. Try to understand, gain more information about narrative analysis and how to report it in a scriptsy or your thesis. Okay. Like here is very clear. If you get to go, if you want to get to know more, is already free in Google Scholar. You can download from this as an example, or you can do like what I did. Okay, I do an author ethnography, means that I create my own handwriting, free writing first, and after that I do narrative. Narrative analysis because I report it narratively. Okay, is it clear? Hopefully it is clear. So my suggestion is that do narrative analysis, get back to it, and then try to understand how to do it when you are dealing with your data. Yeah.
Iya, Pak.
Yes. So Ilmi, I think I will need to continue. We still have 30 minutes to go. Right. So this is again just to encourage you about conducting narrative research. It's always good idea to start thinking of doing this for your professional development or for you as a student to finish your study. For example, in high-level, high-ranking journals, for example, that I observed this whole quarterly, there are more and more qualitative research studies reported and published by them. So one of them, for example, here, retelling stories of desire and Tissot, this is another example of narrative research, which means that if you do narrative research, there is always that possibility for your work to be published of course, in a good quality state. Then you can send it to this journal, for example, this quarterly. So this is just to show you and to motivate you, to encourage you to do narrative inquiry, because now it is a prima donna of many editors, of many journal editors, that they think from narrative research, a lot of lessons that people can share, researchers can share, and the positive values that we can share as researchers through narrative research. No more question? If no, then
There is one, Udi.
yes, please.
Okay. What kind of bias that usually qualitative research deal with, and how to avoid that, bias?
Yes, that's very good. So there is always that kind of issue when we are doing qualitative research because it's very subjective, including in narrative research, it's very subjective. You can get back to this again. This is very subjective because I speak about myself, I write about myself, okay? So in order to reduce that bias potential, we can do more than one method of data analysis. We can do more data collection techniques. Okay, for example, you can do, for example, interview participant. If I said to you about Dadang Buhari, or I forgot his last name, if it is from the memoir only, there might be question: how do you guarantee that this is not too subjective? Why don't you interview? So when it is possible, you will always be highly recommended to also open interview, open conversation with him in order to get enrichment, more information about him. Okay, based on what you have read from the memoirs. So these are part of the strategies to reduce the bias potential in qualitative research in general, including in narrative research. So always think about multiple methodologies, multiple data collection in order to guarantee the trustworthiness issue that I will talk later on, and then reducing the bias potential because it is too subjective. But again, even if it is subjective, that's the nature of qualitative research. What you need to do is that to prove that this subjectivity issue is not a big deal because you go through series of methods that guarantee the quality that the quality of your work. Okay, so I have other 30 minutes to complete the first
I have a
session.
question.
Oh, yes,
Can I
please.
ask Pak Udi directly?
Yes, please, Budina.
Mr. Moderator.
Yes,
Please,
please.
Dr. Dina.
It's a very interesting discussions, Pak Udi. Yeah, what I highlighted from your explanations is the value of stories. Yeah. Oh wait, I still have my. Okay, now you can see me. Yeah. The value of the story. So how then we assess the value of the story? Are all the stories is interesting enough to research? So on what parameters, on what indicators or any others indicators to assess whether this story is important to research so that people can learn from the story, or it depends on the lenses how we see the story.
Right, it's a very good question, Budina. If you see in a research paper, there is always something called pedagogical implication. There is one section for researchers to be given an opportunity to show the value of the study. So it's actually the responsibility of the narrative researcher to show to the audience, to the readers, that there is value that we should share. Okay, sometimes you cannot just implicitly tell because this is a research report, that you have to really put it explicitly. What values are there, and then what are you expecting from readers to learn from the values that you think are there in the papers? So you're right. What is valuable for us might be different from others. But remember, we are writing a research paper for a certain group of community. When we are about concerned about teachers' identity, so the papers then would be addressed to especially those who concerned with this issue. So I think if you ask, is it possible for other to ask or to question the value that we think there in our papers? Is always possible, but again, we have a specific audience for why we write a research report and for why we do narrative research on a certain topic. It's very subjective, you are right, but if you ask the parameters, I think it's about what the topic is about, and then what do you think your readers can learn from your research reports. So there is no specific criteria so far that I understand, but your pedagogical implication would really help your readers to know what to do after reading your research paper.
Thank you very much, Paudi. It's very clear.
Yeah, thank you, Budina.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Right. Ilmi, no more question. If not, then I will continue. I have
No,
30 minutes.
you can. Yep, you can continue.
Right,
Dr.
right. I see that this session one is very, very, interactive, very active participation from many of you, which is very good because we are actually building a knowledge called narrative inquiry, and the process of building this knowledge will always involve an interaction. But for you who still like keep silent and then feel shy, no problem. There is another way of building knowledge is through reflection, reflection through, for example, thinking again about what you have learned so far, or you write, after completing this session, then you can, have some time to rewrite what you've got in order to strengthen your ideas, your knowledge about the narrative inquiry in general. Right. That's the reason why I keep inviting you to ask questions or to write down, because the issue of knowledge creation is actually about code. Code means we are actively participating in building this knowledge to better understand what is actually narrative inquiry. Okay, so I'm not like solely somebody who is knowledgeable in this, but I'm negotiating with you on what is actually narrative inquiry. I provide you some examples, I provide you some theories, but again, it's actually our responsibility collectively to really give meaning to what is actually narrative inquiry. So that's the reason why I keep asking. Ilmi, any question? Or Ilmi, can you ask the audience to write in the chat box? That's actually the reason for why I asked you to be more active in this session. Right, narrative data, oral narratives. Right. So far, we've been dealing with approaches in narrative inquiry. One of them is analysis of narrative. Okay, so analysis of narrative really closely links to the idea of data, narrative data in the form of oral narratives. So in narrative inquiry, interviews are mainly used to elicit oral accounts of language learning and teaching experiences. So the oral narrative here mostly refers to the process of conversation, okay, or to the process of interviews, in-depth interview, as what Ilmi said. So it is very possible for any qualitative researcher, especially those who really concerns with narrative inquiry, to focus on interview as source of data or data collecting techniques or methods. So like other qualitative research in general, there are stages when you are going to collect oral data through an in-depth interview. You will, of course, need to thematize your research. If you want to really understand the teacher's identity construction, then your theme is that will be around that theme. So thematizing is about what you are going to do, what you are going to focus on in your narrative study. So you start with that. I'm interested in teachers' identity development. I'm interested in students' motivation in learning English. I'm interested in understanding the difficulties of EFL students in speaking English. I'm interested in something else. So that is about building the theme or thematizing stage, which is really important in the very first stage of your narrative inquiry, just like other qualitative research. Then you design what kind of interview are you going to do? Is that structured interview? I will tell you more about this later on. Is that open interview, or is that some semi-structured interview? So you start designing the question. You want to, of course, know something more than something else. So you design, you write the question, and this question could be derived from your own reflection, could be from the theories, okay, or could be from your own thought, based on the things that you really want to understand more from your participants. Then you do the interview, of course, transcribing, you then analyze, verify. Verify is like to double check what you have in the transcript, you can get back to your participant asking something that is still not clear to you, and so on. And reporting, you have to report, because if you do research without reporting it, it's not finished yet. You have to report so that other people can read and other people can learn from you as a researcher. Take a look at this. This is very interesting. There is a question, what about the data? Is it only interview? I said, it's not always, although it's possible to have only interview as source of data and then you build narrative from the interview transcripts. But in general, if you see, there are more and more narrative studies that use combinations of several data collection techniques or strategies. In narrative inquiry, it is not uncommon, means it is normal, it is common to adopt multiple methods of data collection. This also to answer a question around bias, around validity issue. So in order to build trustworthiness, to fulfill the trustworthiness or the validity issue in qualitative research in general or in narrative inquiry in particular, there is a way called multiple methods of data collection. In narrative inquiry, you can use teacher journals, learner diaries, classroom observation. So just like other qualitative research, you combine these methods, you gain data from all this to inform your studies. And take a look at this. This is a real example that I got from the literature. A study, a narrative study or narrative research that combines some data analysis or some data collecting methods in order to, strengthen or to ensure the trustworthiness of the study. So in this paper, if you could go again to Google Scholar, which is really easy access, you can download this and then read. Benson and colleagues in 2012 explored the development of second language identities and of learners who opted for study abroad programs. So the project adopted multiple methods of data collection, pre and post sojourn interviews, on-site interviews, blogging, and photograph participation. So a lot of data collections that you can refer, and then you can use them in order to again enrich the stories that you build, the narrative that you build for further analysis. I would really recommend you just to get back to Google Scholar in the next time and then try to see how Benson and colleagues, report their narrative studies in the article. All right. Interview is something broad. There is always another, intriguing question. If you do interview, what kind of interview can we do? And you may say, oh, that's an in-depth interview. But what does that mean by an in-depth interview? What are we going to focus on in narrative research? Then there are a lot of options that you can, get to know and then probably use in the future when you do narrative research. There are some categories of interview, like short story, an interview that refers to a specific event. Okay, so I did my own interview to myself, or I asked somebody to interview me, but the source is actually about me. But because I cannot interview myself, then I asked someone, just an instrument to ask me, so that I can elicit the experience that I have in my mind. Okay, so I focus on a small event. I'm doing a short story interview. Life story, an interview that concerns a person's life story through his or her own retelling. So it's much broader, concerns to the life story. Or oral history, something that is beyond yourself. So for example, the traditions of learning in the community that you probably know because you are living in a certain community. So you've got knowledge and experiences of how learning is built in your community. And people, narrative researchers, would use you as a participant and as an instrument to really tell about what is beyond you that can really actually bring some impacts or influences to you as a student or as a teacher. That is called the oral history. Interview format, as I mentioned earlier, there are some way of structuring your interview. That could be structured. You've decided everything, okay? You follow the question, that's all the questions should be, addressed to the participants, and then you do not develop the question. It sticks to 10 questions that you have already prepared, for example, and no more question, only 10, right? And these 10 are from your reflection based on the purpose of the study or from the theory. Semi-structured interview, okay, you provide the interview list of questions for the interview, but you do not limit yourself with those 10 questions. You still develop questions, but it is important to ask more for a certain element, then you can explore more and more. So that is semi-structured. Or open interviews, just like conversation. You talk with your participants, but you actually have the purpose. The purpose is that to know more about how your participant built him or herself as an autonomous learner of English. So that is the idea that always guides you during the interview, the open interview. So you prepare, but you do not really stick to what you actually prepare. You are more open during open interviews. Okay, this is almost to the end of my presentation. I still have 15 minutes, so I hope I still can, give you some more time to ask questions. I will finish it in 5 minutes, so we still have 10 minutes to discuss further. Ethical issues. This is something that many researchers, I think, from our context, like from Indonesia, who do not really care about ethical issues. Well, this is really important, because if you do not show how the ethic was applied in your research process, then the editors might ask you, how do you deal with the ethical issues? So it's always important for you to tell your audience or your readers about how you conduct the study. So I was just too lazy to write them down, so I just screenshot from a book that I showed to you in the very first slide. So these are some issues that you really need to think of while doing your research. For example, you have to make sure that the participants get consent and give you consent. If there is no consent form you give to the participants, your research wouldn't be considered as a good research, and you are, as a researcher, would be considered as not a good researcher. Okay, so always think about the ethic, and these 4 are example of how you have to really think about it. You can read it, okay, and then what is important is that you try to figure out how to deal with ethic, and how could you explain in your report that there is no ethical issues with your research, because that is really vital in a research report. This is very simple. For those of us wanting to learn to engage in narrative inquiry, we need to imagine ethic as being about negotiation, respect, mutuality, and openness to multiple voices. So you will be dealing with a human being. You have to show respect. You have to, make sure that they really participate in your study because of their willingness for that, because they give you some consent, okay? Because you go through some negotiations to make sure that everything will be fine with the participants. His, secret thing, for example, will be put confidential. Yeah, the confidential issue and so on. So I think this is a very short paragraph or short even sentences that really lead us as a narrative inquirer to think about the ethics, that respect is always important. That's why asking our participant for consent is vital in the process of our narrative research activity or process. Thank you. Maybe, Ilmi, that's the end of my presentation for session 1. So I think we still have even 15 minutes now for discussion, question and answers. You can write down in the chat box, or you can ask me directly. Yeah, Ilmi. Back to you.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Dr. Udi. That was very inspiring presentations, especially talking about narrative inquiry in social science. So, participants, I invite you with questions. You can simply type in the chat box, or you can open up your mic and uh, post the questions directly to Dr. Udi.
Yes, please.
Uh,
Questions or
yeah,
maybe
questions.
comments
We
or
have,
queries.
yeah,
It's yeah.
quite questions, suggestions, or maybe comments. We have 10 minutes, right? 10 or
Yeah,
15 minutes,
yeah, more or less 10 minutes.
or less 10 minutes. Okay, anyone? Or maybe I have to scroll down in case I miss. Okay, I think there's somebody.
Yeah,
There's a
Rindo and
hand,
any
Rindu.
raise
Yep.
hand. Yeah, please.
Okay, you can open up your mic, Rindu.
Yes, thank you.
Mhm.
Well, Dr. Rudy, I'm so interested in the critical thinking process, critical review of the research that you just talked, and I am so keen to know how to be critical in writing a research, of course,
Mhm.
and especially in this narrative inquiry, because I don't think I am a critical researcher in 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 conducting such a good questions for the research and to analyze the real critical review of the research. I think it's very hard to do, and would you mind to share your experiences to how to be more pro and critical in research? Thank you.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Rindo. It's not easy actually to show our criticality in a piece of narrative research because people might perceive differently when we are writing a paper using like an argumentative facts, like the paper that we write so far is very argumentative. Okay, we used to write argumentatively in our research paper, but now we build argument narratively, which is even much harder and much challenging. I agree with you to say that building criticality, showing criticality in our narrative research paper is even more challenging than the conventional one that we always write so far. But again, the issue of criticality is actually about the depth of, for example, your analysis. So if you could provide an interpretations of your finding, you are there showing your criticality. You provide an illustration to show that this illustration is in line with your analysis and interpretation. That is another way of showing your criticality. You put more and more examples from from your data, for example, and then you elaborate them in order to show a better picture of the situation or the context. That is the criticality example. And sometimes in narrative, you don't need to put a lot of resources there. Okay, when, for example, you put it in a narrative way, sometimes you don't need to put a lot of quotation. That is also another example to show your criticality, because sometimes, showing quotation or showing, expert in the bracket, Paul 1998, and then anyone else, okay, and then someone else, okay. So that's in an argumentative one, the conventional one will be part of the criticality, but in narrative context, it's sometimes very avoided. You've already put it in the references, and when you are putting the narrative, the result of your analysis narratively sometimes is not important for you to do the same as what you do commonly in argumentative one. All right, so that's also another being critical when you are dealing with narrative research papers. So make it simple. When you are writing critically, means that you are writing your piece of text clearly, cohesively, okay, and cohesively and coherence. So hold these three as part of the principles when you are writing, because when you are dealing with these three and then you put them in practice in your writing, then you are showing your criticality. So make it simple. Put simply, like, think about the clarity issue, think about the depth of your analysis, and then the coherence and cohesiveness. Those are part of, criticality construction in your text. Yeah. So am I answering your question? But that's to my understanding
Sure.
about
Thank you.
criticality. Yeah. But again, we are in two different worlds when we are doing, an argumentative text way. An argumentative way in writing a paper, and in a narrative way, it's totally different somehow, including in the use of citation, for example. And those are the practice or the implementations of critical thinking in a different way. But again, it is still under the domain of critical thinking and writing context.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much.
Okay, anyone else? I think in the chat box there is another one. How about written narrative? Are you going to explain written narrative in the second sessions tomorrow?
Yes, sure.
Okay,
So
right.
yeah, part of the discussion tomorrow will be on written narrative. So we'll be speaking more on kinds of data in narrative form, and then how to analyze them, also with the ethical issues and reporting and evaluating your narrative research report. That will be for tomorrow.
Okay, so stay tuned, Adolfina Crisfu, okay, for tomorrow. Anyone else? So, can I ask questions?
Yes, please. Okay, please, Pak Ilmi.
Okay, so I'm just wondering if we are collecting data in a narrative research, meaning that we are exposing with the participant story, right?
Mm-hmm.
So usually inside the story there is an emotions of the participants, right?
Yeah.
So as a narrative inquiry researchers, how do we balance the emotions from the participants, okay, into our into the perspective of the researcher?
Yeah.
So,
great question. Thank you very much, Ilmi. One of the benefit of having a direct interview with the participant is that to know and to to get close, and then to see even the gesture during interview. And that is sometimes like emotion or mood change during the interview. And for qualitative researcher, for a narrative researcher, this kind of emotion thing is something that is really important, in order to enrich the descriptions of data when we are reporting our results of analysis. That mood, that emotion tells something, because people can cry when telling something, and if you interview me how I live my life as a student, in one university in the UK, I would probably cry a little bit for an event that you couldn't even feel, but I could feel that, this emotion thing, emotional moment in which, for example, I cried a little bit, then a very good information to, to be brought into your report on, the level of emotion that the participant bring into the interview, which means that this is a moment, a crucial moment in the life during his or her doctoral degree journey. And you can explain, okay? So that's why I said, please be very mindful and sensitive during the interview, because there are a lot of data which are not expressed orally, but through gestures. Okay, through mimic, for example, we can tell that somebody is sad, somebody is feeling so emotional for certain reason. Then you can even further ask question, not asking like, why are you crying? But you can ask with another way, but to really get to know more why he cried, why that moment is so essential or so emotional in his life during study time, for example. So not be skeptical with that thing, but make it as, enrichment for your data. Yeah, that's why you make a note on that part, which then later on you can get back to it and then illustrate more when you report your research.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Reddy, for the answers.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Anyone else?
I see in the chat box. In the chat box, somebody is asking a question from Adolfina.
This one, right?
Yeah. So if you can read it for me, then yeah.
Yeah, I think I've just asked you about this, about written narrative, right? You said that you're going to explain written narrative tomorrow, right?
Okay, yes, you're right. So we'll be there tomorrow.
Okay.
In the written narrative, and we'll be discussing more issues in narrative. Written narrative, yes.
Okay. So if there is no more questions, I think since the times also shows 3:30, I think.
Yeah.
That right?
So yeah, inshallah, we still have one more session tomorrow. So I'm looking forward to meeting you all again in our last sessions tomorrow, and hopefully what we've discussed in this session brought something, I can say enlightenment or curiosity in order to know more, so that you can come again tomorrow to discuss further.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, right before I close today's sessions, I'd like to wrap up what Dr. Udi has just expounded in today's sessions. He talked briefly about narrative. At the beginning, he talked briefly about qualitative research, and then he continued with narrative inquiry as a form of qualitative research. Which of course you have just heard. Narrative inquiry research deals with uh, is it, research on somebody's experience. Okay, and the second one, he talked briefly about kinds of oral narrative in the form of interview, either semi-structured interview or in-depth interview. And then the last part, he discussed about ethical issue in narrative inquiry study, which is also important because I think it's very sensitive issue. So I think if there is no more questions, okay, I'd like to give a quote. I think I got a quote from Corneli Clandillin, right? 1990, right? Humans are storytelling organisms who individually and collectively lead stories live. Thus, the study of narratives is the study of the way humans experience the world. Am I right, Dr. Udi?
You are right. Clandillin, right. You are just reading what Clandillin says.
Yes, I got a quote right.
That's great quote anyway. That represent a narrative inquiry in general. That's cool.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. Okay, I'll see you again in tomorrow's sessions, right, for the second sessions. And before you leave the meeting, please give a round of applause to Dr. Udi Samanhudi for today's sessions.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
See
you
you
so
tomorrow,
much.
inshallah.
See you tomorrow. Give back to you, Dr. Dina, please.
Okay, thank you very much for a very nice closing, Pak Ilmi. Thank you very much, Dr. Rodi. And I, as even a coordinator, I would like to not inform actually, to remind the students or participants of this study, just learn a lot from all the topics that you have learned so far from this online short course series, especially for my students from English department of Untirta. So I really hope that this semester or next semester there will be thesis Yeah, excuse me?
No, we can hear clearly.
Okay. So I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye. Assalamualaikum.
See you.
warahmatullahi
Bye. Waalaikumsalam
Okay.
warahmatullahi
Yeah.
wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi. Thank
See
you very
you.
much, Ilmi.
Thank you.
Budina,
Thank
and
you.
thank
Most
you,
welcome.
everyone.
It has
you,
been a
Pak
very
Udi.
productive
Yeah,
meeting,
thank
right?
you. Thank you.
Thank you for the discussions. It's so lively.
Right. Thank you very much. See you tomorrow, inshallah.
Yeah. So.